people think that goes away in April with the heat. Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barrett.
And I'm Chaz Ciadello.
This week, red state America is now feeling the full impact of the coronavirus pandemic, but there are signs this time may not be so bad.
We learn how where you live changes how you live and whether you can stay out of jail.
And we're taking a road trip to the Sunshine State of Florida.
But first,
as Americans prepare to celebrate their Independence Day, the 4th of July this weekend, cases of COVID-19 have spiked alarmingly in more than 30 states. Arizona has shut down bars, gyms, movie theatres and water parks for the month of July. LA County, home to around 10 million people, has closed its beaches for the holiday weekend. States including Kansas and Oregon have now made wearing face masks mandatory. So have parts of Florida, including Jacksonville, where the Republican convention is due to be held next month. Not the image President Trump was hoping for. And reporters wanted to know if that has changed his thinking about wearing a mask.
So I talked to the president before coming out here. It's his choice to wear a mask. It's the personal choice of any individual as to whether to wear a mask or not. He encourages people to make whatever decision is best for their safety, but he did say to me he has no problem with masks and to do whatever your local jurisdiction requests of you.
Just won't be wearing one. And you can't escape the politics of this pandemic. In April, 2/3 of coronavirus cases were in states that voted for Democrat Hillary Clinton in 2016. But it has gone from a blue state to a red state disease. This week, almost 3/4 of new cases were in states that voted for Donald Trump. But in places like Dallas, Texas, some people really don't like it when stores request they wear a face mask in the checkout area.
I don't give a fuck about Dallas. You dumbass motherfuckers and dumbass motherfuckers. Put all that shit the fuck back.
she does not seem happy.
We all have days like that.
But look, she better learn to deal with masks because the national trend in daily new cases is very clear. Case numbers have shot up to be way above the worst of March and April. Although still no signs of an increase amongst daily deaths, fingers crossed there. More worrying though is the way this thing's spreading. If we look at the map of states that are moving towards or away from meeting federal reopening guidelines, you can see throughout June the red zones, the ones that are getting worse, steadily spreading across America, like a virus if you will. Today, over 30 states are getting worse. And these are the states that are most struggling. There are now 9 states where more than 10% of tests are coming back positive. That's a bad sign. And remember back in April, only New York and New Jersey had more than 2,000 new cases a day? Well, now 6 states do, including over 5,000 new cases a day in Florida, Texas and California. About all those new cases though, a study this week suggested the protests were not associated with this new COVID surge. In fact, if anything, cases decreased near protests. That might seem counterintuitive, but there's actually more social distancing in cities with protests. Why? Because the protesters themselves are a relatively small number of people and everyone else was much more likely to stay home. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it is. For more, we're joined by Dr. Joe Gerald, Associate Professor of Public Health at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Dr. Gerald, thank you for being with us on Planet America.
Thank you.
So why is it that we are seeing this major uptick in new cases in states such as yours? Is it simply that places like Arizona reopened too quickly?
Yes, I think that's the simplest explanation. Arizona, in some ways, is suffering from its own success. And so we actually shut down fairly early in the outbreak, but then let up after only 6 weeks. And so this is pretty much the resurgence from that.
And Doctor, is it inevitable, do you think, that just as we're seeing a surge in new cases now, in 2 to 4 weeks we're going to be seeing a surge in deaths as well?
It looks like that's probably not going to be the case, and there's an interesting reason behind that. What we've seen with this second outbreak is a dramatic change in who's becoming infected. And so early in April, it was the median age was about 50 for new infections. Today, it stands at 38. And so we're seeing a much younger and healthier population being at greatest risk. And because they are healthier in general and have fewer chronic conditions, they're less likely to need hospital care and less likely to die.
Professor, do you also think the reduction in deaths might reflect doctors getting a better handle on how to treat this thing, or is it just demographics?
Personally, I think it's mostly demographics, although there have been some recent optimism on treatments, thinking about things like dexamethasone and so forth. But for me, I think the primary driver is the demographics.
Obviously, though, older people are still at a significant risk from this virus. So is enough being done to try and protect them?
There's no explicit plan in place to do that, but I think mostly people are rational. And so I think young, healthy people recognize, one, that they're at lower risk, but two, they actually have to get back into the economy for their work and jobs and livelihoods. Whereas the population over age 60, I think, can recognize their heightened risk. There's been enough education around that, but they're also in a better economic position to stay sheltered in place and minimize their interactions with others. So I think it's a little bit of several things.
Now, we were told that this was all about flattening the curve. So hospitals would have a chance to build up resources and then they'd be able to deal with whatever cases arose until a vaccine was developed. Now, even with this current spike, isn't that plan still working?
It is. We are just barely hanging on. We have a little bit of safety margin left here in Arizona, but it's predicted somewhere between the end of the middle of this month or the end of this month, we're going to run up against our stated or listed capacity. We do have the ability to bring on some additional beds, what we call surge beds, but these are locations that aren't typically used for patient care, and they may not be staffed by the same types of nurses and doctors and so forth. So we have a little bit of room, but it's not a lot.
Professor, we did see a significant reopening around the Memorial Day holiday in the United States and an uptick in infections as a result. We're coming up this weekend to the 4th of July, Independence Day holidays. Are you concerned that that is further going to fuel infections?
Yes, absolutely. Anything like a holiday that brings people in closer contact with each other creates more fuel for the fire. And so in Arizona, though, our governor just this past week, several days ago actually, has reinstituted some of our physical distancing measures, closing down bars, limiting gatherings to less than 50 people. And so hopefully that will mitigate some of these encounters going into the holiday weekend.
Now, Arizona is currently seeing about 25% of tests coming back positive. Is that reflecting Arizona not doing enough testing, or is COVID that much out of control at the moment in Arizona?
So Arizona has lagged other states in their ability to test in the quantity that's needed. And this has been ongoing for a long time. And so certainly a lot of it represents testing capacity. But the infection currently is pretty much out of control, and it's growing so quickly, even as we're increasing testing, it's just simply not keeping up.
And Professor, do you think we're any closer to knowing what the future may look like? Earlier in the year, the President was pilloried for saying that one day it's just going to disappear, but some past pandemic viruses have done exactly that. What does the future hold, do you think?
I think for the foreseeable future, so we're talking the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to be looking at regional outbreaks. There's just too many susceptible individuals in the population, and this virus has unique characteristics such that so much of the infections are asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic. And so there's a huge reservoir of infected people out there that we really just don't understand and have a good handle on. And so I don't see any relief in the near future.
Dr. Joe Gerald, thanks very much for joining us on Planet America.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome.
Now to the reports that first emerged in the New York Times over the weekend that Russian military intelligence secretly offered bounties for Taliban-linked militants in Afghanistan to kill coalition troops. That was during peace talks aimed at ending the long-running war there. Then yesterday, the Associated Press claimed White House officials have been aware of this bounty since early last year, which immediately begged the question:
what did President Trump know about Russians allegedly putting a bounty on American lives in Afghanistan, and when did he know it?
Maybe, like Sergeant Schultz, he knew nothing. The White House insists the president was not briefed on the matter.
I'm telling you this, that there's no consensus in the intelligence community and that the dissenting opinions from some in the intelligence community exist.
But yesterday, the Times reported the president was in fact briefed in writing in late February, and that not only did a Russian intelligence unit offer the bounty, they paid it to militants for killing US and coalition forces. As far as Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is concerned, this is another example of Trump and Russia looking pretty sus.
I don't know what the Russians have on the president politically, personally, financially, or whatever it is, but he wants to ignore. Something is wrong with this picture.
So still a lot of questions around this story, Chaz, including, did the president actually read the briefing? A lot of insider accounts have said he doesn't read the presidential daily briefing personally every day. Also, has he ever raised any objections with the Russians in all of this?
These are good questions, although we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. As you say, John, the New York Times and AP have been reporting that Trump knew about this intelligence, but CBS's Catherine Herridge was told that the intelligence only reached low levels at the National Security Council and did not go further, with neither the president nor vice president being briefed about it. And NBC is reporting that Trump only learnt about the matter after it became public in news reports. But if Trump wasn't briefed, then that would also be a problem, because British security officials are saying that even they knew about the plot. And now the Washington Post is reporting that the bounties resulted in the deaths of several US service members. So either way, this could really blow up.
Yeah, and we're going to be having a deep dive into this story in Friday night's Fireside Chat on ABC News. Now to the poll position this week. Democrat Joe Biden continues to enjoy a sizable lead over President Trump, just over 9 points in the average of national polls. And the reality that Trump could lose this election seems to be sinking in.
It's so crazy what's happening. Here's a guy who doesn't talk. Nobody hears him. Whenever he does talk, he can't put two sentences together. I don't want to be nice or unnice, okay? But, I mean, the man can't speak. And he's going to be your president because some people don't love me, maybe.
While there have been some blowout polls putting Biden in a very strong position, not just nationally, but also leading by wide margins in some key battleground states, one or two other polls this week are pointing towards a tighter contest. Republican polling firm Trafalgar, for instance, found President Trump leading Joe Biden by almost 1 point in Wisconsin, with 10% still looking for a third-party candidate or just undecided. And a Susquehanna poll found Biden's lead in Pennsylvania at just 5 points, about half of the average. And those two Rust Belt states could hold the key to the presidency this November. President Trump, meanwhile, has been road testing a new nickname for Joe Biden. For over a year, it's been
Sleepy Joe Biden.
But Sleepy wasn't really scaring anyone. So this week, in no fewer than 9 tweets, it became
Corrupt Joe Biden.
Kind of sounds like a bit of a retread of crooked Hillary Clinton. We'll see if it catches on, Chaz.
I think Trump's going to be needing more than a new nickname, John. During the past 6 incumbent re-election campaigns, the difference between the president's final pre-election job approval and his share of the popular vote has averaged about 1%. Right now, Trump's approval is 41%. You cannot win an election with 42% of the vote. And this is not a one-off. Trump hasn't led in a single live interview national poll all year. He's the first incumbent president in polling history that's been the case for. And Trump's bailout options are not looking great either. Winning over undecided voters? In the New York Times' poll of battleground states, 55% of registered voters already said there was not really any chance they would vote for Trump. So he's going to have to change some minds. How about relying on ex-Sanders voters to turn on Biden? Biden's winning 92% of self-identified Democrats. So Trump is going to have to do this the hard way. But not all smooth sailing for Biden, mind you, John. In a recent New Jersey mail-in election, 1 in 5 ballots were rejected. Many are conflating this with fraud, and it is true that out of 16,000 mail-in ballots, 3,000 were disqualified. But 2,300 of those votes weren't necessarily fraudulent, they just failed the signature check. And that's a real insight into what we might have ahead of us this year with all this mail-in voting. A lot of votes being disqualified. This could be a problem for Democrats. They're the ones going all in on mail-in voting, and COVID might be a problem as well. Look at those red rectangles there. They show voter registration falling compared to 2016. And which parts of America are being most affected by COVID? Cities, where Democrats vote. There's a real uncertainty about this election, John, and no poll can measure that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a long night in November, maybe a long week or two. It is time, though, to hit the road again as we continue our tour around the states that are likely to determine the outcome of this election. And this week, we're heading down to Florida, the swingiest of swing states. Florida, the Sunshine State, famous for spring break, tanned retirees, and more than 1,300 golf courses. That's the most of any state. No wonder this guy likes it. And all that sunshine is good for growing oranges. 40% of the orange juice in the world comes from Florida.
Turn on to 100% pure orange juice with Florida's seal of approval. It's juice packed to standards even higher than the federal government's.
President Trump is just one of 21.5 million people to call Florida home, making it the third largest state by population. That's a big change in the past century. Back then, Florida didn't crack the top 30. Air conditioning and refrigeration has certainly made the sunshine a lot more fun. Florida has seen waves of immigration, retirees from colder northern states, Cubans who fled the communist takeover there in the late 1950s. There are 1.5 million Cuban Americans in Florida today. The state is more than 1/4 Hispanic, a little over half the population is white, and almost 17% black. Tourism is usually worth about $90 billion to Florida's economy every year. 110 million Americans and 11 million overseas tourists flock here for theme parks like Walt Disney World, SeaWorld, Universal Studios, and then there's the beaches. Although, whatever you do, don't sing while wearing a swimming costume. For some reason, that is illegal in Florida. So is parachuting on Sundays, but only if you're an unmarried woman. As well as dumb laws, Florida also boasts the Everglades and lots of cruise ships, although coronavirus has taken a chunk out of tourism and the whole economy this year. Florida's unemployment rate is now at 14.5%, more than a point above the national jobless numbers. Politically, Florida is diverse. It's been a bellwether for decades, backing the winner in every presidential election since 1964, except when they voted for President George Bush over Bill Clinton in 1992. And in some years, Florida has also been the decider. In 2000, TV networks first called it for Al Gore, then they backtracked.
NBC News is now taking Florida out of Vice President Gore's column and putting it back in the too close to call.
And then
George Bush is the president-elect of the United States. He has won the state of Florida, according to our projections.
Gore conceded, then retracted that concession. It was so close there were recounts, court battles over the ballot papers, confusingly designed butterfly ballots were poured over, dodgy voting machines produced hanging chads and dimpled chads. In the end, when a US Supreme Court ruling effectively put a halt to counting, Bush was declared the winner in Florida by just 537 votes out of almost 6 million cast, giving him the White House. 4 years later, Bush won Florida by 5 points over Democrat John Kerry, giving him a win in the Electoral College and the presidency for another 4 years. In 2016, Donald Trump won Florida's 29 Electoral College votes by a margin of just over 1%, around 100,000 votes, although his share of the vote was actually lower than Mitt Romney's was when he lost to President Obama in 2012.
Hello, Florida. We love you, Florida.
But President Trump could be in big trouble in the Sunshine State this year. Vice President Joe Biden leads by more than 6 points in the average of Florida polls. But within that average, Biden leads by 11 in a tip battleground poll and just 1 in a much larger St. Pete poll taken in late May. So, once again, Florida could be very close this November, possibly the decider.
Now, a few weeks back, I told you about some of the racial inequalities in America, and in passing, I mentioned this. 62% of black kids born between 1955 and 1970 grew up in medium or high poverty neighbourhoods, compared to only 4% of white kids. Fast forward 30 years though, and it hasn't changed at all. Now it's 66% to 6%. In fact, black families making $100,000 a year or more live in more disadvantaged neighbourhoods than whites making less than $30,000. And by the way, 52% of black families live in high poverty neighbourhoods over multiple generations. Thanks, Chaz. But those neighbourhood stats might be important. In fact, they might be the most important stats. To the wall!
Big, beautiful wall.
The neighbourhood you grow up in can make a huge difference. Sometimes it's in obvious ways, like prisoners are more likely to have grown up in socially isolated and segregated neighbourhoods with high rates of child poverty, such as North Nashville, where 1 in 7 children born between 1980 and 1986 could expect to be in jail in their early 30s. Also unsurprising, growing up in disadvantaged neighbourhoods reduces a black child's chance of graduation from 96% to 76%. But a bit more surprising is when parents and kids grow up in non-poor areas, the kids have an average IQ of 104, but when they both grow up in poor areas, the kids have an average IQ of 96. And that's even if they themselves are not poor, just the neighbourhood. People in high distress neighbourhoods also tend to be more obese than in low distress neighbourhoods, especially black people in high distress neighbourhoods. And strangely, while white non-poor people have the same rate of diabetes wherever they live, black non-poor people have higher rates of diabetes when they live in poor neighbourhoods. So what makes a neighbourhood good or bad? Well, according to Raj Chetty, who's done more work on this than anyone, neighbourhoods that lead to higher income mobility and positive outcomes generally have less segregation and less income inequality. They've got better schools, they've got more community engagement, and they've got more families staying together. Obviously, high income is related to these as well, but even amongst bottom quintile parents for income, the share of their children that go on to reach the top quintile of income is quite different for different communities, from 4% in Charlotte all the way up to 13%. But how does that all work? Well, if you move to a nice area where you're an adult, it makes very little difference to your outcomes, to be honest, but boy does moving make a difference for your kids. When kids moved to a lower poverty area before the age of 13, it lifted their income in one study by an average of 31% in their mid-20s. And it's not just income. Moving early increases children's rates of college attendance, marriage, and it reduces teenage births. Their future income gap actually seems to close by about 4% for every year that a kid moves to a better neighbourhood. And equally, when they move to a worse neighbourhood, their future income reduces by about 4% of the difference per year. You can see this effect on college attendance by age 23. The earlier the kids moved to a better neighbourhood, the larger the effect it had on their futures. You can see our maths scores improve for every extra year that students move from high poverty school districts to low poverty school districts. And you see similar kinds of patterns for all of those benefits from before, until the kids are in their early 20s. Then, no more effect. I should say as well that while these terrible neighbourhoods are largely African American, white people who live in those neighbourhoods also have lower rates of upward mobility. But interestingly, disadvantaged neighbourhoods seem to hurt boys a lot more than girls. If we compare, say, a girl growing up in Charlotte, and that's one of the most disadvantaged places in America, and compare them to a girl growing up in New York, which is much better, it makes little difference to her future employment. But poor boys from New York, that's these guys here, are much more likely to end up employed than poor boys from Charlotte. These kinds of dodgy areas like Charlotte even affect boys' mental health. When boys moved from high poverty to low poverty neighbourhoods, they experienced 25% less depression, anxiety, and dependency issues. So what makes those poor neighbourhoods so damaging? The three main issues seem to be violence, incarceration, and pollution. They seem to especially affect black males even after accounting for poverty. Take crime, for example. Now, when a murder occurs in a child's neighbourhood, it knocks 7 to 8 points off their IQ when they're tested. But those effects wear off after a week or so. But what do you think happens when there is always a murder in the neighbourhood? Next, incarceration. Now, obviously, that results in fewer black fathers being around. Chetty found that black fathers being present in the community correlate more with reducing the black-white income gap than any other factor. Note, white fathers being present wasn't far behind, and they both correlated more with reducing black-white inequality than the share of black people above the poverty line or the employment rate. And the most interesting aspect was that Chetty found poor black boys did well in those places regardless of whether their own fathers were present or not. It was about having lots of fathers present in the community generally. Finally, pollution. Now, studies have found 90% of the children in black and Hispanic neighbourhoods are poisoned by lead. That can make people sick, less intelligent and more aggressive. One projection found that if black boys had been exposed to the same amount of lead as white boys were, their chance of incarceration would be more like 5.8% instead of 11.7%. In other words, it would eliminate 60% of the prison gap between black and white boys. Just that one change alone. Now, look, there are many more potential factors I could go into. Neighbourhoods, they don't explain everything, but this war has gone on like forever. I feel like I started in the 90s. So I'm gonna move on, yes. The fact is, we know that there is a problem here, okay? The question is, how do you fix it?
Big, beautiful world.
This week, something rather surprising happened. Politicians in Mississippi, a deeply conservative southern state, decided it was time to change their flag. Getting rid of the Confederate battle flag that sat in the corner for a century and a quarter. And just minutes after the bill passed on the weekend, down came the flag over the State House, despite the objections of a handful of vocal protesters.
It's coming down.
And you can hear protesters in the background. There have been protesters at the state capitol all day who support this state flag. And right now, ladies and gentlemen, again, you're witnessing history in the state of Mississippi.
20 years ago, Mississippi's voted by a 2-to-1 margin to keep the flag as it is. So this is a big step. A new flag is yet to be designed. It will be voted on in November. The law just says it must have the words "In God We Trust" on it, and it must not have the Confederate battle flag on it. But the debate over flags is unlikely to end there. The square Confederate battle flag and the rectangular Confederate Navy Jack are the best known of the secessionist flags, and the ones that establish themselves in popular culture as symbols of Southern pride, if not out-and-out racism.
The pride of the South they call the General Lee.
And that is the flag that's also being banned from NASCAR and other events, although this is the official Confederate flag, known as the Stars and Bars. They stopped using it on the battlefield because it was confusingly close to the flag of the United States. But does the state flag of Georgia, adopted in 2003, look a little familiar? And North Carolina's flag is clearly an echo of the Stars and Bars as well. Arkansas not only references the Confederate battle flag, but that blue star above the word Arkansas represents the Confederacy. Even Alabama and Florida's St. Andrew's crosses were based on state battle flags from the Confederate forces in the Civil War. So, will the new Mississippi flag have similar Confederate overtones or make a clean break from the past? We'll see. This week, President Trump signed an executive order instructing the Justice Department to prosecute people who damage federal monuments. The language in the order itself was pretty out there. It claims
Anarchist and left-wing extremists have sought to advance a fringe ideology that paints the United States of America as fundamentally unjust.
In recent days, protesters in Washington knocked over the only statue of a Confederate general in the Capitol. That was Albert Pike. And they tried to take down President Andrew Jackson as well, but they were stopped. Jackson was a big supporter of slavery and he made a fortune from it. He chained them and whipped them himself. He also ethnically cleansed regions of Native Americans, causing scores, maybe thousands of deaths. But has all of this gone too far? This was the third most shared story on Facebook the other day. A photo of a vandalised Vietnam War memorial.
Disgusted! BLM protesters decide to vandalize a Veterans Memorial for those who died in the Vietnam War. But yeah, these are normal people who are sane and peaceful. Not! I hope this pisses you off enough to share it!
Pissed off they were, and share it they did. Almost 200,000 times. Trouble is, while the Vietnam Memorial in Venice Beach, California was vandalised, it happened in 2016. It was not done by Black Lives Matter protesters. It was just done by a group of taggers, Chaz.
Oh dear. If you're going to critique something, you better get your facts straight. Talking about which, last week I mentioned that people tore down the statue of the guy who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner for some reason. And that wasn't incorrect, but it implied that there was no reason to take down his statue. Some people online pointed out that that guy was a slaveholder who defended slavery in court, and he famously described black people as a distinct and inferior race of people, which all experience proves to be the greatest evil that afflicts a community. So, yeah. That's a reason. I probably should have looked it up before I went on air. After all, if you're going to critique something, you better get your facts straight.
Words to live by, Chaz. Words to live by. Meanwhile, there was a very significant Supreme Court ruling this week.
Yes, June Medical versus Russo. This was a case about whether Louisiana could insist that abortion doctors had to have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals. And the reason this was big was because that would have resulted in only a single doctor in a single clinic qualifying to provide abortions in the whole of Louisiana. Abortion activists thought this case might provide a backdoor to effectively banning abortion in red states. And it was a bit weird, because only 4 years ago in Whole Woman's Health versus Hellistat, the Supreme Court struck down an almost identical law 5-3. Of course, since then, the partisan balance of the court has changed, so abortion opponents hoped rerunning this question might work out well for them. But the Chief Justice disagreed, saying even though he continued to believe that Whole Woman's Health had been wrongly decided, the question before them here was whether it should be applied in this new case. And he said respecting precedent required the court to treat like cases alike. So since the Louisiana rule was just as severe as the Hellistat rule for the same reasons, Louisiana's law should also be struck down. And down it went, 5-4. So the Chief Justice saved abortion in red state America by switching his own position. Never a dull moment.
Feeling low energy? Look great and feel fantastic with the Donald Trump exercise plan. Trump's wowed the experts with his incredible energy, and now you can too.
He is healthy as can be.
Featuring signature Trump workouts like walking.
I do a lot of exercising because I walk around a lot. I'm doing a lot of things.
Cross-country walking.
We walk like the equivalent of about 3 blocks, which is fine.
The president had more stamina and more energy than just about anybody there.
Saluting.
Like this, yes. Like this. Almost 600 times.
And handshaking. Oh, more saluting.
Because let me tell you, you do that 600 times, you go home and you say, it's like a workout without a weight.
And extreme hand movements.
Even when you're at a podium making a speech and you're ranting and that's exercise. Don't get yourself. So I get plenty of exercise.
With the Trump exercise plan, there's no diet necessary.
Wendy's, Burger King, and McDonald's, and French fries served in paper cups with the presidential seal.
They say don't eat this food, don't eat that. Well, maybe those foods are good for you.
The Donald Trump exercise plan. Feel great today.
That guy's got a serious weight problem. Go home, start exercising.
And that is all for this week's Planet America. We're going to take a 2-week break as America celebrates the 4th of July holiday. We'll see you back here on Wednesday the 22nd.
Although I'm still making pep podcasts.
Really?
There's a fresh pep episode right there, right now. And we'll have one more Fireside Chat on ABC News this Friday before the break. See you then.
Good night.